The International Tribunal in Geneva fell utterly silent as Jonathan Roumie stepped to the podium. Dressed in a simple charcoal suit, a small wooden cross visible around his neck, his voice was steady and clear as he addressed the Global Ethics Council, a body rarely challenged, let alone publicly confronted. Seated high on the dais was Bill Gates, presiding as the chair of the Special Committee on Technological Governance and Human Rights. Known for his clinical language, philanthropic polish, and vast influence, Gates leaned forward, fingers interlocked, his expression tightening as Roumie began to speak about digital overreach and ethical violations in biometric surveillance across impoverished nations. Mr. Chairman, the evidence before this council, Roumie began, but Gates cut him off mid-sentence. Mr. Roumie, Gates said, his voice clipped and cold, we've heard enough moralist rhetoric. This is a forum for facts, not religious pageantry. A wave of tension washed over the room. Diplomats, journalists, and observers exchanged glances. Everyone present knew they were witnessing something unprecedented. A global tech magnate had just dismissed a man of faith speaking on behalf of the voiceless, and done so in full view of international media. But what Jonathan Roumie did next would transform this tense moment into a spiritual and moral earthquake. One that would not only shake Gates, but challenge the very foundation of global power structures built on data, control, and sanitized compassion. Before we dive deeper into this extraordinary confrontation, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next chapter in this unfolding story of conscience versus control. And let us know in the comments, do ethics still matter in a world run by algorithms? The stage was set for a clash that would expose decades of unchecked influence, institutional arrogance, and a quiet rebellion of conscience, all personified in two men who couldn't be more different. To understand the gravity of what was about to unfold, you need to know who these two men were, and why this moment would matter so deeply to the future of ethical governance. Bill Gates is not just any public figure. At 69, the billionaire technocrat is viewed by many as a benevolent innovator, a man who remade the modern world through software, then spent his post-Microsoft years reshaping public health, education, and global development. But to others, especially critics of centralized power, Gates represents something more dangerous. A quiet empire built on influence without accountability. Educated at Harvard and shaped by Silicon Valley's rise, Gates built his fortune on code, but extended his legacy through control, funding health policies, influencing agricultural reform in the global south, and now, most controversially, backing biometric identity systems that critics say strip dignity from the world's most vulnerable populations. His voice, measured and intellectual, often spoke of data solutions and targeted scalability. But beneath the jargon, his opponents saw a consistent pattern: decisions made without consent, in places with little power to push back. Legal scholars have documented numerous instances where Gates-funded initiatives bypassed democratic oversight, implementing digitized ID systems in refugee camps, distributing medical interventions without local ethical review, and consolidating health data in regions with fragile privacy protections. More than once, Gates had brushed off concerns from ethicists and activists with a simple phrase: it's not about feelings, it's about outcomes. At 50, Jonathan Roumie was an actor best known for portraying Christ in The Chosen. But in recent years, he had emerged as an unlikely but powerful advocate for more responsibility in global decision-making. He was no lawyer, no politician, but he was deeply informed, and more importantly, he was not afraid. Raised in a working-class Catholic family in New York, Roumie had experienced both fame and failure. But through it all, he carried something deeper than reputation, conviction rooted in compassion. He had spoken in refugee camps, prayed with the forgotten, and challenged policymakers to remember that dignity cannot be programmed. When he was called to testify before the Ethics Council, many thought he would deliver poetic platitudes and be dismissed quietly. But those who underestimated him had never seen Roumie with truth in his hands. He didn't come to accuse, he came to reveal. This wasn't a PR stunt. Roumie had in his possession documented evidence that biometric surveillance programs funded by the Gates Foundation had violated consent laws, ignored local governance, and in one case even led to the denial of medical care for those without digital clearance. This was not a clash of personalities. It was a battle over what kind of future humanity deserved. On one side, a man of numbers, metrics, and systems. On the other, a man of compassion, humanity. The On the other, a man of spirit, memory, and unshakable truth. The chamber of the Global Ethics Council in Geneva was formal and intimidating, lined with dark mahogany panels and an elevated three-chair tribunal platform. Bill Gates sat in the center, flanked by two other technocrats from Europe and Asia, both of whom seemed perfectly content to let him guide the proceedings. The room was filled past legal capacity. Human rights observers, ethicists, and digital privacy advocates had flooded every available seat, while overflow crowds watched live feeds in satellite rooms. Major international media outlets had sent their top investigative journalists. Everyone knew this hearing could redefine how technology interacts with fundamental human dignity. Roumie's advocacy team had spent the morning methodically laying out the case. Testimony from African communities where biometric ID systems had failed, leaving children unable to receive medicine without scannable clearance. Evidence from India showing digital exclusion of rural families during government food distributions. Reports from Latin America where Gates-funded pilot programs were quietly collecting health data from indigenous populations without their consent. Leading ethicist Dr. Amir Hadari had presented a harrowing timeline showing how these programs disproportionately affected the poor, the elderly, and those already marginalized. Academic scholars gave their verdict. The systems may have been efficient, but they weren't just. Yet Gates sat impassively throughout the session, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the table, eyes betraying a growing impatience. He interrupted multiple witnesses. At one point he scoffed, "We're not here to discuss emotions. We're here to evaluate scalable outcomes." But then, Jonathan Roumie approached the podium. The mood in the room shifted instantly. Conversations ceased. Pens were laid down. Even the translators removed their headsets for a moment. "Members of the council," Roumie began, his voice calm yet resonant, "I stand here not as a statistician or a policymaker, but as a man who has walked among the ones your models often forget." He paused, letting silence settle over the tribunal. "I've met the mothers who were denied care because their child's iris wasn't in the system. I've prayed with the sick who were told their worth must be verified by a number. I've looked into the eyes of the undocumented elderly, people who survived war, famine, and exile, only to be told they do not exist because they do not scan." Before Roumie could continue, Bill Gates leaned forward sharply. "Mr. Roumie," he said, his voice taut and dismissive, "this forum is not a pulpit. We're here to examine infrastructure policy, not host a sermon. I've heard enough emotional appeals." The words struck like a blow. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Several human rights lawyers exchanged glances. Even a few of the international panelists shifted uncomfortably. But Roumie stood firm. "With all due respect, Mr. Gates," he said, "now this is not emotionalism. It is the moral cost of your programs. You don't need a theology degree to understand this, just a conscience." Gates's voice sharpened. "You may be used to delivering monologues to audiences who already agree with you. But here, we operate on evidence." Roumie didn't flinch. "I'm not here to win applause. I'm here to tell the truth. And the truth is this. Behind every efficiency upgrade your foundation funds, there are real people, real lives, reduced to data fields and left behind by systems they didn't ask for." Gates's tone turned cold. "Do you honestly believe these communities are incapable of adapting to modern identification systems?" The question dripped with condescension. A quiet gasp rose from the room. A UN delegate arched an eyebrow. A child rights advocate buried her face in her hands. Roumie inhaled slowly, his face composed but his eyes steeled with quiet fire. "It's not about capability," he said. "It's about access. And even more than that, it's about consent. These people aren't incapable. They are simply uninvited from the conversation that affects their very existence." He stepped forward, placing a hand gently on the worn leather folder in front of him. "The evidence shows," Roumie continued, "that in regions where your systems were implemented, failure rates were highest among the most vulnerable populations, and accommodations were never made." Gates's cheeks flushed slightly. "I don't appreciate the implication that my foundation disregards ethical considerations," he snapped. "And I don't appreciate the dismissal of suffering as unscalable," Roumie replied, his voice firmer now. "Because the moment human dignity becomes a variable in a spreadsheet, we've already lost the soul of what we're trying to build." The entire chamber was still. The observers weren't just watching a testimony, they were witnessing a reckoning. Then Jonathan Roumie opened his folder. "If you question whether I'm engaging in dramatic rhetoric," he said calmly, "then I invite the council to examine your own words." He held up a printed transcript. This is from a 2018 private roundtable funded by the Gates Foundation, where you stated, quote, "In certain regions, the culture simply isn't ready for democratic infrastructure. Sometimes top-down implementation is more efficient." A shocked hum spread across the room. One of the panelists put down his pen. A translator whispered "Mon Dieu" in French. The cameras panned quickly. But Roumie wasn't finished. He turned to another page. This is from a 2020 policy memorandum, again under your leadership. You wrote, "Equity is not always achievable in real time. Sometimes a certain margin of exclusion is acceptable for broader technological progress." A silence fell like judgment. Gates tried to interject, but Roumie gently raised a hand. "And this," he said, "is from a private communication to regional directors. Pushback on biometric registration is largely cultural. These populations will eventually adapt." The silence cracked into murmurs. People were no longer just listening. They were awakening. And the man at the center of it all, Jonathan Roumie, stood not with anger, not with triumph, but with something deeper. Conviction without pride, truth without vengeance, mercy with a spine. "This," Roumie said, holding up a highlighted printout, "is from a 2021 internal memo issued by your foundation, Mr. Gates, where you personally stated that human rights protections are outdated frameworks designed for a slower, less efficient world." Gates, who had remained seated until now, stood fully upright. His face had gone pale. "That quote is taken out of context," he snapped. Roumie didn't react. He simply turned the page. "And this," he continued, "is from a 2020 keynote address, where you argued that the Global South will require a new model of participatory governance that moves past legacy concepts like voting rights and instead embraces technocratic consensus." The chamber gasped. Reporters clattered on keyboards. Legal observers stopped taking notes and simply stared. But Roumie wasn't finished. "And here," he said, pulling out a third document, "is your 2019 editorial in Technonomy Weekly, where you wrote, 'The emphasis on local consent is slowing progress. Some regions must be upgraded, not consulted.'" A silence fell like a hammer. Everyone in the room now understood. They were not simply witnessing a policy critique. They were watching the moral veil lifted from one of the most powerful men on earth. Gates tried to regain control. "This is highly inappropriate," he muttered, turning toward the panel chair. But Roumie's voice carried through the stillness like a verdict. "What's inappropriate," he said, unwavering, "is that a man with a documented pattern of dismissing consent, ethics, and democratic rights is now overseeing global development strategy under the guise of humanitarian aid. What's inappropriate is calling truth theatrical when the real performance is being orchestrated from that chair." The explosion was instant. One of the council members dropped her pen. Another whispered urgently to the ethics clerk beside her. Activists in the gallery stood up, some in stunned silence, others already in tears. A few began to applaud softly before security motioned for them to sit. Gates slammed his hand down on the tribunal's table, the sound echoing through the chamber like a thunderclap. "This proceeding is adjourned," he shouted. But it wasn't. The damage was done. Jonathan Roumie had just done something unthinkable. He had exposed a global influencer's deeply embedded ethical contradictions, using his own words, in his own counsel, on international record, and before a watching world. As Gates called for a recess and stormed from the panel with clipped footsteps, the chamber erupted into movement. News crews sprinted to file urgent bulletins. Advocates gathered in clusters, whispering, praying, some visibly shaken. A few council staffers looked around with conflicted eyes, as if the room itself had shifted permanently. And all across social media, it was already viral. The clip of Roumie holding up the quote and calmly saying, "The real performance is being orchestrated from that chair," had already been clipped, captioned, and shared hundreds of thousands of times. Roumie reveals, #Gates exposed, ethical technocracy, consent, is not optional. They all trended within minutes. Lawyers, tech ethicists, clergy, and human rights organizations were stunned. Never before had a man with no political title, no government role, and no academic credentials walked into a room of such consolidated power and told the truth so plainly without fear. And yet, Roumie wasn't finished. When the council reconvened 30 minutes later, Gates returned to his seat visibly rattled, flanked by 2 assistant directors and several advisors. But his posture had changed. He was no longer the untouchable orchestrator. Roumie, however, looked just as he had an hour earlier, calm, collected, and ready to composed, resolved, unafraid. Before I resume, Roumie began, returning to the microphone, I believe this council must now address the one matter everyone in this room is too cautious to name. A slow hush fell again. The chairman didn't interrupt. Gates sat motionless. My legal and ethical submission this morning, Roumie said, was accompanied by a formal motion requesting Mr. Gates's recusal from all current biometric policy oversight based on conflict of interest and historical disregard for democratic norms. There were gasps, even among the delegates. Recusal was rare in global forums, but this was a direct challenge to power, a line in the sand. Roumie opened the folder again. In addition to the documents I've shared publicly, he said, my team has submitted an additional dossier to the ethics panel, detailing 12 projects in the past 5 years where Gates-funded programs bypassed local ethics review boards. He looked directly at Gates. And finally, Mr. Gates, I must inform this council that yesterday evening I received a phone call from a former executive at one of your regional partner organizations. The call was legally recorded under Swiss law with consent. In it, the executive recalled you stating, and I quote, "We can't wait for every village elder to sign off. They'll adapt once the data shows results." The chamber gasped again. Gates bolted upright. That's categorically false. But Councillor Elena Kova from Slovenia was already speaking quietly to her aide. Another member, Dr. Isa Mbembe, closed his eyes and sighed deeply. Roumie's voice never rose. This conversation, alongside your public statements and documented policies, demonstrates a pattern of instrumentalizing the poor while masking control as benevolence. I am not here to humiliate you. I am here to protect those who cannot defend themselves in these halls. I demand to hear this supposed recording, Gates barked. It has already been submitted to the ethics panel, Roumie replied, and to the UN Special Rapporteur on Digital Rights. Copies are also being provided to this council's clerk under formal motion. The ethical bomb had detonated. A man of faith had walked into the heart of a technocratic empire and, with truth, patience, and righteous evidence, struck a blow heard across the world. The council president spoke softly into the mic. This tribunal will recess for the remainder of the day. The recusal motion and all supporting documents will be reviewed immediately. As the delegates filed out and the murmurs turned to movement, Bill Gates sat in silence, no longer unchallenged, no longer shielded by influence. And Jonathan Roumie, without raising his voice or pointing a finger, had changed the conversation forever. But what Jonathan Roumie had done that day wasn't just a legal turning point. It was a moral reckoning and a political awakening. As he quietly packed up his worn folder of documents, a long line of human rights lawyers, theologians, and journalists waited, not to question him, but to shake his hand, some with tears in their eyes, others simply nodding in reverent silence. Reporters shouted over one another. Mr. Roumie, will you call for Gates to resign from all global digital ethics boards? Are you planning to testify before the UN Security Council? Will this inspire more public challenges to technocratic overreach? But Roumie didn't answer with slogans. He just smiled faintly and said, "Truth doesn't shout, it stands." And today, it stood. Outside the chamber, the scene was electric. Hundreds had gathered, some holding handwritten signs that read, "No algorithm above the human soul. Accountability is not anti-progress. Data without dignity is tyranny." News vans lined the boulevard. Reporters spoke breathlessly into cameras broadcasting live around the world. Among the crowd was Dr. Oceana Ferreira, a former political prisoner from Brazil, who now led a global ethics watchdog. Through tears, she told the BBC, "I've seen regimes fall, but I've never seen one man speak so gently and bring so much power to its knees." By nightfall, human rights groups around the globe were announcing marches in support of Roumie's call for ethical transparency. The Geneva Accountability March was scheduled for Saturday. Cities like Nairobi, Mumbai, and Buenos Aires were already organizing solidarity vigils. The World Council of Churches issued a statement. Jonathan Roumie has reminded us that justice begins where silence ends. Social media was on fire. A video of a young ethics student on TikTok explaining how global tech power can be challenged with a single folder of truth had over 6 million views in 4 hours. Clips of Roumie quoting Gates's own words were trending with hashtags like #Roumie stands, #conscience before code, no man, above ethics, #tech without mercy is violence. But perhaps the most unexpected impact came from inside the system itself. A group of former program directors and project managers from Gates-funded initiatives came forward. They published an anonymous letter in the International Ethics Journal that very evening. In it, they described a culture of fear around questioning Gates's decisions, suppressed concerns from field workers in Africa and Southeast Asia, and a systematic refusal to consult local communities during digital rollouts. The letter ended with a simple line: "Mr. Roumie, thank you for saying what we were never allowed to." The consequences came swiftly. By sunrise, the Ethics Council president announced that the oversight panel would be reconstituted. Gates was removed from his seat on the tribunal, pending a formal investigation into conflicts of interest and ethical violations. Later that day, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights confirmed they were reviewing Roumie's full submission, including the recorded phone call, policy transcripts, and unpublished memos. One legal scholar from Oxford called it the most significant ethics challenge to a non-governmental figure in modern history. Even longtime technocrats were stunned. Professor Didier Langlois, who had defended Gates's initiatives in over a dozen global forums, told Le Monde, "We used to whisper about these contradictions. Now they're public record." Mr. Roumie didn't just present an argument, he lit a fire no one can put out. The confrontation between Jonathan Roumie and Bill Gates became one of the most viewed political moments of the year. The clip of Roumie calmly holding up the 2019 quote, "Some regions must be upgraded, not consulted," was viewed over 60 million times in 5 days. CNN, Al Jazeera, and France 24 broke into scheduled programming. BBC called it a moral earthquake in the tech human rights conversation. Reuters simply headlined, "Truth at the Podium." Legal commentators dissected every frame of the exchange. At one point, when Gates's composure visibly cracked, one analyst noted, "You can see the exact moment when the script of control broke." TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, everywhere, new audiences who had never heard of global biometric policy were now asking one simple question: who gave these systems the right to define us? Photos of Roumie standing beneath the tribunal's seal, folder in hand, went viral. One split-screen image showed him beside Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and Nelson Mandela, captioned simply, "Conscience is not outdated." Major global news outlets couldn't get enough of the story. CNN, BBC World, Al Jazeera, and Fox International ran wall-to-wall coverage, though their tones varied. Liberal commentators hailed Jonathan Roumie as a modern-day prophet who pierced the illusion of humanitarian tech with the quiet force of truth. Conservative outlets were more conflicted. Some defended Bill Gates, suggesting Roumie had grandstanded, but even they struggled to justify Gates's own recorded words. The most powerful commentary came not from pundits, but from legal and ethics scholars. The Global Policy Journal called the moment the most consequential challenge to unelected power in the digital age. The International Bar Review featured Roumie on its cover with the headline, "When Conscience Walks into the Room." Social media turned into a digital battlefield, but facts cut through the noise like scripture in a storm. The quotes, the audio, the memos, the recorded call, an undeniable pattern had emerged, and not even Gates's staunchest defenders could dismiss the evidence. The hashtag Roumie reveals hit 2.5 million tweets in 5 days. Memes flooded the internet. Roumie drawn as a quiet warrior, holding up a folder like a shield. TikToks explaining the ethics of global surveillance went viral among students who had never even heard the term biometric policy before. Governments and institutions, some long silent, began to speak. In Washington, Speaker of the House Mike Johnson, despite ideological differences, made a rare cross-aisle statement. "While I may not share Jonathan Roumie's politics, no one can deny the moral force of what he did. He reminded us that ethics isn't optional, even for the powerful." Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer took it further. "It's time we apply the same scrutiny to private power that we apply to public institutions." But the most shocking shift came from unexpected quarters. Polls showed that 60% of Americans, including a majority of conservatives, supported Roumie's call for transparency and consent in global development programs. And it didn't stop there. Within 2 weeks, bipartisan legislation was introduced in the U.S. Congress to establish new ethical oversight mechanisms for private organizations with geopolitical influence. Similar efforts sprang up across Europe, Africa, and Southeast Asia. The European Commission proposed stricter data ethics regulations. Kenya announced the formation of a community consent board to review all foreign tech initiatives. Argentina introduced a digital sovereignty charter. Institutions responded too. The UN Ethics Council created new reporting procedures for non-governmental overreach. The World Health Organization added a human rights oversight panel for digital health partnerships. And within the Global Ethics Tribunal itself, new rules were introduced. No participant with active financial interest may preside over an issue affecting that interest. Law schools and ethics departments rushed to incorporate the confrontation into their curricula. Oxford labeled it a watershed moment in civil accountability. Harvard Law renamed its annual symposium, Speaking Truth to Power, the Roumie Gates Precedent. Civil rights professors broke down Roumie's presentation as an example of nonviolent advocacy in hostile spaces. Philosophy departments debated whether Gates represented the technocratic idol of the 21st century. And the effect on young people was staggering. Law school applications referencing Roumie's testimony as inspiration surged by 31%. Faith-based student organizations merged with ethics clubs to form conscience coalitions. A wave of young digital rights advocates began filing real challenges to corporate systems once thought untouchable. For Roumie himself, the impact was immediate and humbling. Within days of the hearing, his foundation's inbox was flooded with invitations. Harvard Divinity School invited him to deliver the annual Faith and Justice lecture. The Vatican's Pontifical Academy requested a private audience to discuss digital ethics. The NAACP invited him to keynote their global summit on surveillance and civil liberty. His Twitter following rose from 60,000 to 2.4 million in a week. Major publishers began a bidding war for his book. His original title, Faith in the Margins, was rebranded Silence No More, The Day We Challenge the Algorithm. The advance? Over $2 million. Film rights? Already optioned by a major studio. But Roumie never let the moment become about fame. When asked by the New York Times what he felt after the confrontation, he simply said, "It wasn't courage, it was obedience." What began with one man, one voice, and one folder became a movement. A Judicial Ethics and Tech Accountability Caucus was formed in the U.S. House and Senate. NGOs across 18 countries created a shared database for reporting ethical violations in global aid partnerships. The phrase Roumie Standard began to appear in legal journals as shorthand for when truth challenges unchecked influence. And most importantly, hope returned. Because for once, the world saw that even the most powerful can be held to account if someone dares to speak not louder, but truer. Law and ethics schools across the world saw a dramatic spike in applications, many of them citing Jonathan Roumie's stand as the inspiration for pursuing careers in human rights, constitutional integrity, and ethical technology regulation. What had unfolded in that tribunal chamber went far beyond a personal confrontation. It had become a moral blueprint, a living example that global governance, even at its most insulated, could still be corrected when a single person had the courage to speak truth to unchecked power. International legal scholars hailed the moment as proof that principled dissent is not just a historical relic, but a necessary force in a rapidly evolving world. In the International Journal of Comparative Law, one noted, Roumie proved what our textbooks only theorize, that ethics, when embodied, can confront empire. Governments and public bodies took notice. The European Court of Human Rights updated its guidelines on biometric compliance, explicitly citing the Roumie Gates confrontation as a case study. The African Union adopted new protections for data sovereignty. The Vatican's Academy for Life issued a new ethical charter on technology and human dignity. As the dust settled, a deeper conversation emerged, one that had been too uncomfortable to confront until now. Should powerful technocratic figures face mandatory ethical reviews, just like elected officials? A Reuters poll conducted days after Roumie's stand found that 73% of global respondents supported periodic reviews of private sector actors with geopolitical influence. Should organizations that influence health, identity, and education be subject to international human rights audits? Should there be limits on how long one person or foundation can control global infrastructure without formal oversight? What had once been academic theory was now political urgency. Some worried that Roumie's confrontation blurred the lines between moral activism and institutional governance. Conservative legal thinkers expressed concern over spiritual overreach into technocratic autonomy, but progressive scholars argued the opposite. They said Roumie had not violated the structure of global governance, he had restored it. They pointed to the UN Charter, which guarantees the dignity and consent of all peoples. They referenced international law, which protects against surveillance without consent. And they cited the UNESCO Universal Declaration on Bioethics, which clearly states, Technology must always serve the person, never replace their will. Roumie had not disrupted order. He had reminded the world why order exists in the first place. The question on everyone's mind was, would others follow? The answer came quickly. Diplomats in Geneva began quietly attending closed ethical hearings. Activists filed more transparency requests in 1 month than in the previous year combined. Parliamentarians in Canada, Kenya, and Italy began attending tech committee meetings, not to participate but to observe, with Roumie's folder-like binders in hand. A global culture shift had begun. What was once unquestionable was now open to scrutiny. What was once untouchable was now held to account. The confrontation between Jonathan Roumie and Bill Gates will be remembered as a watershed moment in global ethics, a day when conscience interrupted convenience, when truth stood in a room built to silence it and refused to yield. But perhaps the greatest legacy was what it showed the next generation, that no title is so sacred, no chair so high, no foundation so wealthy, that it cannot be challenged when it forgets the dignity of the human being. As Roumie said in his first public address afterward, democracy is not just votes, it is vigilance. Justice is not just law, it is love with a backbone. And no one, no algorithm, no billionaire, no system is above the moral call to be accountable. And so, from a single act of moral clarity, the world remembered. That courage is contagious. That truth does not need volume, it needs conviction. And that even in an age of control, the human soul still matters. Thank you for following this journey. Let us know in the comments, should private influence be held to public ethical standards? What other systems need this level of accountability? And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated on future stories that challenge the system and call us back to something higher.